Hello, everyone. This is Gilgamesh. And yes, there is Egyptian in the Hebrew Bible. Begin with, we need to understand that Egyptian was unreadable until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799. Thanks, Napoleon. We knew a few Egyptian words from Greek writers and other ancient writers who told us about different words in the Egyptian language. But for the most part, the knowledge to read Egyptian was completely lost after antiquity, and no one before 1799 in modern times knew how to read anything in Egyptian. And so deciphering it was a long lost goal. And what we found was we found this stone that's called the Rosetta Stone that had in it two different forms of Egyptian writing and also Greek writing. And we could read Greek. So we used it to decipher the Egyptian. And for the first time, Egyptian became known again. Linguists were able to first crack Egyptian back in 1822, and between 1822 and 1824, they started to publish their work and get further along in deciphering the Egyptian text. By the 1830s, we were starting to really get a handle on Egyptian, although it would be slow progress for quite some time after that. Around the late 1800s, particularly like 1890s, we started realizing that there were Egyptian loanwords in other languages, particularly Hebrew. And this makes sense. Egypt was a world power in that region. And for many centuries, they dominated the whole area where the nation of Israel and the nation of Judah existed. And we also, of course, know the story that at one point the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And so all of this makes sense that they would be adopting words out of the Egyptian language. We do this in English all the time with foreign words as well. So it's a very natural thing to do. If this holiday, maybe you had a charcuterie board. Well, charcuterie is not an English word. We borrowed it and we brought it in, and now it becomes an English word. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. There were Egyptian words that were used that were popular and descriptive, and they wanted to use them, so they adopted them. This is what we started to discover as we discovered Egyptian again, is that some of the words in Hebrew, particularly some words that we weren't sure what their meaning was or what their origin were, turned out to be Egyptian words. Now, Thomas Lambdin, who is a great linguist and wrote a very important grammar of the Hebrew language, he wrote a paper back in 1953 that sort of set the standard for this, gathering together all the previous research and kindly writing it in English, whereas most of the research before that was in German. He wrote this paper called Egyptian Loanwords in the Old Testament, and he wrote it in the Journal of American Oriental Society. I've got the link up there if you want to read it. This paper has held up well over some 70 years, and it's really still quite a good read today and a great starting point if you want to learn more about this. So if this interests you, go read that paper. We're going to start off with a word you already know, and that's Pharaoh. In Hebrew, it's Pharaoh, and it means just what you think it does. It means the king of Egypt. It comes from an Egyptian word that means great house. And so this is a word that we already knew was going to be a borrowed word from Egyptian, because we knew this from other languages that also spoke of this word. But it was nice to finally see it in the Egyptian text and see that, yes, the word Pharaoh is indeed an Egyptian word. And so that was kind of a nice confirmation there. But this was one we kind of expected was going to be the case. And it's a word that everybody knows. So among the words that come from Egyptian, there are some odd ones. This word here, sha'atnez, it is a cloth that is woven together from two different types of sources. It's a very specific word. And it's a very strange word, sha'atnez. And we see it in Deuteronomy 22:11. Thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts of wool and linen together. This very technical word here, we had to use several words to bring it into English, but this comes from Egyptian. And so this is an Egyptian word that was used by the Hebrews to describe what they were talking about, of a cloth woven from two sources. So there's another Egyptian word. Then this is a fun one here. I only recently came to understand how significant this one was. I had always assumed that the Hebrew word sak, which translates as sack or sackcloth into English, that the idea that they sound similar was just a coincidence. But it turns out I was wrong. This actually comes from the Hebrew. And I cut and pasted here an etymology of the word sack, which you can Google it yourself and find this exact same thing. It means a bag. It comes from Middle English sack, which came from Old English, sack, which came from Mercian and Old Kintish, and we go back here to Proto-Germanic, the Middle Dutch, High German, Old Norse, Gothic. All of that comes from Greek, which also borrowed from Latin. And so it probably comes from the Greek sakos, meaning bag, made of goat hair, which is from the Semitic. Compare Hebrew and Phoenician sak, which is sack or bag, or a mourning attire, sackcloth. So yeah, our word sack comes from Hebrew, but the Hebrew word comes from Egyptian. And so next time you think about saying the word sack, realize that you are talking about a word that has filtered down through literally thousands of years and several languages and somehow managed to remain largely unchanged, and you're using part of the old Egyptian language as you say this. I found it interesting here too that the widespread use of the word sack to mean a bag is probably due to the incident in the biblical story of Joseph in which a sack of corn figures. I've got one of the verses of the many verses where the word shows up, that Joseph gave order to fill their bags with grain and to replace every man's money in his sack, Hebrew word sak. Another item that we have a lot of Egyptian influence on is the temple or tabernacle and the vestments that were used in that place. And so our first word here is kotam, which is a seal or signet ring. And it talks about here that they were supposed to be engraving some stones with the names of the children of Israel, and they're supposed to do it as a jeweler engraves signets. This word signets, kotam, is actually from Egyptian. And then as they're supposed to make a variety of clothing for the priests to wear in the temple, these garments that they're going to make is going to include a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, and so forth, a turban, and also a sash. And the word for sash is avnet. Avnet comes from Egyptian. And a lot of this makes a lot of sense because the Egyptians had a very detailed and complex temple cult, and they had lots of fancy ceremonial outfits that they would wear in this place. And so the Israelites simply borrowed these words as they were developing their own temple cult for what their priests should be wearing. They borrowed the Egyptian words for it. We also have a whole lot of precious stones that come from Egyptian. And this is just one example of that, but I included here because it was part of the vestments. And this is akhlama, which is translated as amethyst. And it was one of the things that was in the high priest's breastplate or his pectoral, which had the various 12 fancy stones in it. And one of them is translated as amethyst. We're not 100% sure exactly what kind of stone a lot of these were, but this one actually seems to come from Egyptian as well. Then here's a good example of how we can really be sure some of these things really are coming from Egyptian. There's this simple word, shesh. And in the Hebrew Bible, it means two things. It means alabaster, and it also means a special white linen cloth, particularly a white linen cloth that is used commonly in the temple setting. And so we have both examples of this in Hebrew, and they both exist in Egyptian as well. When it has a stone determinative on it, it is referring to alabaster. When it has a clothing determinative, there's a final hieroglyph, then it refers to this white linen. Alabaster as a stone was prized because it was gleaming white. And a lot of ancient Egyptian monuments were actually covered in alabaster. And that was mined later because it was such a valuable stone. This gleaming white stone was then used for the same word for this very white linen that they would wear. And so both these words come into Hebrew with those same two meanings. Talking about the clothing of the priests again, you shall weave the coat in checker work of fine linen, and you shall make a turban of fine linen, and you shall make a sash. And the word sash here is the same word that we discussed a moment ago. So yeah, this idea of this white fine linen that they were making the temple clothing for these priests out of comes from Egyptian. There's also this word, pach, which is a thin plate of metal. And in Exodus, it talks about how they hammered out gold leaf. And this was for the crown portion of the high priest's vestments. And so this word here, again, comes from Egyptian, pach, a thin piece of metal that's been hammered out. Then there's another word for turban. Yeah, we have two different words for turban here. And this word is pa'er. Pa'er you can find in Exodus 39:28, It is a different word than what was in the other verses we've already quoted. And it says here, the turban of fine linen and the caps, that's our word, air, of fine linen, and the linen undergarments of fine twined linen. So these are talking about all the various vestments for the priests who would operate in the temple with two different types of headdresses and also undergarments of these white material. Then another thing that has to do with the temple is the wood that the ark was made out of, as well as several other things in the temple here, is a wood that is actually left untranslated. They just bring it across as shittim wood, and it comes from a singular, we suppose, of shita, and this is actually another borrowed word from Egyptian, meaning an acacia tree, or maybe an acacia bush. It wasn't much of a tree, but this shittim wood is actually an Egyptian loanword as well. Then we have another fun story here. The word for ark, teba, is from Egyptian, and it means coffin or chest in Egyptian. And we find two stories with this word in it in the Hebrew Bible, and that is the Ark of Noah and also the ark that the baby Moses was placed in by his mother. It is not the same word that is translated as Ark of the Covenant. That word is Aron, and yeah, the Raiders of the Lost Ark, that was a different word. But the ark, the boat, both of Noah and of Moses, was this word here, teva. And the word for papyrus in Egyptian comes down into Hebrew as gome. And so when we have the story here in Exodus chapter 2, verse 3, when she could hide him no longer, she made for him an ark, a teva, of papyrus, or bulrushes is how it was translated, but it means papyrus, the papyrus plant, which was incredibly important in Egypt, very strong fibrous plant. They made a lot of things out of it. So she made him this basket, this ark of papyrus, both using Egyptian words. And then, of course, Noah was told to make an ark of gopher wood. Another word that you'll know, this is havanim. Havanim is ebony. Notice that they sound the same. This came in all the way to English. Again, I believe it passed through Greek to get here. But yes, this started out as an Egyptian word that was adopted into Hebrew, only shows up once, and that's in Ezekiel 27:15. Interestingly, it shows up right next to Ivory. So apparently Ezekiel was ready to make a piano. And this word filters down into modern languages largely unchanged. We dropped the A at the beginning. We changed the mem off the end a little bit, but it's the same word. And it's come down to us into our modern language. And it's a fascinating, rare word in Hebrew. Also, Egyptian words were brought in for various units of measure. The ephah, which was a corn measure, the hin, which was a liquid measure used for oil or wine, and the kav, which was used for, we don't really know a whole lot, it only shows up once. But yes, these units of measure came from Egyptian into Hebrew. And so they're also from Egyptian originally. Other words that came in from Egyptian, the word ahu is some type of a particular marsh plant, apparently grows in Egypt. And in the story of Joseph interpreting the dreams, we had the 7 fat cows that come out of the Nile, and they fed in the reed grass, or I think King James goes with meadow. But the word here is ahu, which comes from this Egyptian word. There's also the opposition in the Joseph story were the magicians of Egypt here, the kotam. So the kotam show up in 3 stories. The Joseph story where he's telling the dreams, or interpreting the dreams, and the Moses story where he changes his staff into a serpent. And then also, oddly, it shows up in Daniel, where Daniel interprets dreams. And that's probably not a coincidence. This is a very specialized word for the magicians of Egypt, and they would not have called the magicians by the same name over in Babylon where Daniel was, but the author of Daniel very much wanted his story to parallel Joseph's story, and so he lifted this word and placed it in his book so that it would more resonate with the story of Joseph and his opposition of the magicians in Egypt. And so we have some creative use of words there to make the stories connect with each other. Now, We also talked about shesh just a moment ago, that it was alabaster and linen. Another place that it shows up here is in the Joseph story, along with this word here, which is another word for a signet ring, tabaat. So tabaat shows up here that in both the Joseph story and also the Esther story, Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And then he also clothed him in garments of shesh, in garments of fine linen. And so we have Joseph being invested with power for the signet, from the signet ring right here. We have a parallel over in Esther, where the king Ahasuerus, took off his signet ring and gave it to Haman, the Agagite, the bad guy. And then at the end of the story, the king took off his signet ring, which he had given to Haman, and he gives it to Mordecai, the hero of the story. And so again, we have the idea of a very specific Egyptian loanword being brought into later periods to try and make the stories resonate and connect with each other. And then we'll close it off here with a Hanukkah miracle, just for Hanukkah here. This word is not a Hebrew word, it is an Aramaic word. Now, if you've celebrated Hanukkah before, you know that there is one candle that is raised up above the rest or set aside from the rest, and it's called the shamash. And anybody who knows Hebrew can tell you shemesh means sun, like sun in the sky. And they're right and wrong at the same time. That's not what the candle means. The name for the candle, we are told, means an attendant or a servant. And that's not what the word means in the Hebrew Bible. But there is one place in the Hebrew Bible, not in Hebrew, but in Aramaic, in Daniel chapter 7, verse 10, where this word shows up, not as a noun, but as a verb, where it says, and 1,000 thousands served him. And so this is this word, shamash. It's an Aramaic word, not a Hebrew word, does not mean sun in the sky. It means a servant or attendant. And it actually comes from Egyptian. So as you're lighting the last lights of Chanukah this year, thank the Egyptians. They're the ones who came up with the word for the shamash. Hope you enjoyed this. If you did, like, subscribe, click the bell icon, coming over, join us in Discord. There's a lot more loanwords than what I could possibly cover in this short video, but I hope you found this insightful and useful. We'll see you in the next one.